Abu, I'll start.
Yeah, go ahead.
Introduction.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Yep.
Thank you. Well, just want to start with a big welcome and thank you for joining us today. Just to say, unfortunately, one of our panelists is poorly and can no longer join us. So Fiona won't be joining us, but we have a great group of panelists and some really interesting questions. And there will be time for you to ask questions. What we were just talking about, if you have a question, I'm happy for you to pop those in the chat at any time. But if you could put a capital Q at the beginning so I can identify the where the questions are coming in, that would be brilliant. Thank you. So I want to start by very briefly saying, why have we chosen to focus today on communication for this webinar? I guess communication is really, really important for our working lives, and words really matter, and words can be really helpful, they can heal, but they can also hurt. And in all of our inclusion events, we've really focused on having great conversations, very honest conversations, and learning from each other, all of us coming from very different backgrounds and different lived experiences. But sometimes these conversations should be difficult. There is very little value for us coming together as a community to look at inclusion if we all just furiously agree with each other and don't call out any differences of opinion. Cosy conversations don't really move the agenda forwards. So what we want today is to get a wide range of perspectives on what good communication looks like, but also how it's changing and how we need to adapt to these changes as the world around us changes. Before we get started, Abu will share a video, which I won't say anything more about, but hopefully will prompt some thoughts as we go into the panel discussion. Each of our panelists, so Abu, Sophie and Campbell, will then be invited to introduce themselves and say a few words about their general thoughts on communication and why it's important to them personally. I've then got a few questions that I'll ask, but as I said, very keen to get questions come in from the group. So on that note, Abu, I think I'm handing back to you.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, this is just the agenda for us here today. But yeah, we thought it'd be good to introduce the session with a video from YouTube. Hopefully you can all hear it, and there are captions as well that are recorded. So yeah, I'll just play that and yeah, enjoy. Can you all hear that, by the way?
In my early years, people used to use the word queer, and it was always used in a derogatory sense, usually preceded by an Anglo-Saxon word beginning with F. So I always shunned away from that word. When I was about 17, I saw a play, a musical, Broadway musical, called Carousel, and there's a song in there where one of the first lines is, "You're a queer one, Julie Jordan," and I was jolted by that because I thought that somehow related to my condition. But that was that, and I tried to avoid the word queer as much as possible. In 2014, I was recovering from a major surgery, and I was depressed and didn't have anything in my life that I felt was fulfilling. And so my niece, who was always so helpful, bought me something she thought would work. And it was an Apple TV. And so I started watching it, and I became borderline obsessed with it. And one of my favorite sites is YouTube. With my interest in the theater, I followed all the kids that are performing now on Broadway, off Broadway, most musical, some dramatic actors. And they started referring to each other as queer and using other words that to me always were negative. But then it suddenly dawned on me that they're not dissing each other. They're just having a conversation. I mean, that's the way they spoke. And so I was less offended by it. Recently, there's a young performer. His name is Troye Sivan. I, even at my stage, love his music. It relaxes me. It calms me. I think he has a beautiful voice, and I enjoy. He writes most of his own music with collaborators, and I enjoy his music. And he recently released a new album. To celebrate the release, he did a concert at the Capitol Records building in California, Los Angeles. And he did a concert on the roof, and he had an audience, a small audience there. And after the concert, there was a person from the press who was interviewing people in the audience about what they think of his music. This interviewer asked one of the young men there. He was, I think he said he was 18 years old. He was dressed in a button-down shirt, tapered slacks, and high-heeled pumps. And the interviewer asked him how he felt about Troye Sivan. He said, "I just love him. I can't get enough of him. He's so wonderful." He said, "What is it so wonderful about him?" And he said, "He's so unapologetically queer." And that opened the door for me. And I can now accept the word queer and be a part of it. When you've lived as long as I have, you realize that things change. Certainly, thought has changed, perceptions have changed, and vocabulary has changed. And what once might have been offensive may now be acceptable. And I'm sure that in the future, it will evolve even more.
Great. Okay, so I'll just hand back over to you, Sarah.
Great, thank you, Abu. So we shared that video really to start our thinking and our debate around both the power of language, but also how people's individual perception of language and what it means for them can be unique, but can also change over time. So I'm going to now ask each of my panelists to introduce themselves and give us a couple of words about communication. I'm going to go in alphabetical order by first name. So I'm going to go to Abu, then Campbell, and then to Sophie. So over to you, Abu.
Thanks, Sarah. Oh, let me just stop spotlighting. I'm doing a lot of multitasking right now. Hi, everyone. I'm Abu Rashid. I'm a market improvement lead at MOSL and EDI lead for MOSL, as well as the EDI rep for the Southeast area for the Institute of Water. So in communication, my general thoughts on communication is knowing how much to say or knowing what to say is a bit of an art, I think. Personally, I sort of debate with myself. I have a few other voices in my head that I debate with on to know what is best to say or how much to say or how much to share. I think some problems and some issues in society around the world could hopefully be solved if people from the outset communicated quite clearly what they wanted to say and also be open to constructive conversation and dialogue. I think that would probably help a lot of situations and from the very outset. I'm an introvert, so this might have an impact on how I speak. I tend to listen more than I speak and share. I like listening both to what is being said as well as what is not being said. I think body languages and pauses speak volumes in themselves, but that might be related to my introversion, or just because I think people have more value in what they're trying to communicate than I do, possibly. As Stanley mentioned, I think communication is always evolving, and we always think about the best ways to get our points across. For example, and it's something that I shared with Sarah a few years ago, the term BAME or BAME. was used in 2020 and 2021, I think, even used by the government in identifying certain groups, but that term now is more or less defunct and I think has been universally dropped. Another term that was used for quite a long time was purdah in the political sphere. That was used for a long time and now I think it's being dropped or has been dropped for pre-election period. And I think Lydia, who's coming back from maternity leave for the Southeast area, wrote a blog on this for the Women's Utility Network describing the use of purdah and now using the pre-election period. So my thoughts on all this is there's no need to introduce unnecessary jargon, I guess, and terms that you have to then Google and find out what they mean. If you're trying to describe something, maybe don't have weird linkages to other bits of other cultures. Just describe whatever you want to describe in clear and simple words, rather than using purdah, which actually I was pronounced as forda when I was younger, but that's a whole different story. But yeah, that's all I wanted to share, Sarah.
Great, thank you very much, Abu. Campbell.
Hello, I'm Campbell. I have a chemical engineering degree and I've worked in the water industry for nearly 10 years now, which is a bit scary. I run the RFK Accessibility Network, and I have cerebral palsy. So that's the most common physical disability from birth. And I guess in terms of communication, having such a visible disability, I found has had quite a big impact on my life and people's perceptions of my ability and the way they communicate with me. So often people assume I have a learning difficulty and can be quite patronising and talking down to me. And I guess I spent quite a lot of my life trying to change these perceptions. So I competitively debated at university and I've always been quite kind of passionate about increasing discussions to include disabled people, because I think, I feel like we're the forgotten community in many ways in these sort of conversations, especially within the workplace. Like there's this assumption that most disabled people don't work, and I think we get forgotten quite a lot. So I'm trying to shift that perception. So the RFK Accessibility Network, we chose to be called accessibility rather than disability because, there's some controversy around the word disabled and it's trying to work out the balance with that. So disabled, the prefix is negative, not abled is what it kind of means linguistically, and it's trying to get away from focusing on what we can't do and focus on what we can do. And it's hard to rebrand a word that is inherently kind of negative, but coming up with an alternative word to describe such a range of people can be quite difficult. I quite like the word crippled, and there's quite a big movement to reclaim that as a word, but obviously that's still quite controversial in a lot of circles. I call it the crip card when I get a benefit from being disabled. So if I get to jump a queue, I say it's the crip card. Trying to make light of situations, language, humour has always been used to try and make things more acceptable. And I think there's a lot of dialogue in this space about what's the best way to proceed and how to increase disability inclusion. So yeah,
Thanks.
That's me.
Thanks, Campbell. I'll go to Sophie and then I'll come to my first question. Sophie, over to you.
Yes, so my name is Sophie Turner. I work within the comms team at MOSL. My official title is Digital Communications and Accessibility Lead. I've always been really passionate about people, user experiences and the journeys that they take. I trained as a journalist, and before MOSL I worked in marketing. And I've always just been really interested in ensuring that a user has what they need to achieve their goal. So whether it's reading an article, buying a product, or browsing a website, and obviously communication is a massive part of that. By working with various sort of CRM systems, so content management systems, and lots of encouragement from my manager, I went down a bit of a rabbit hole of digital accessibility a couple of years back. And I was really shocked at how much is considered or better yet, what is not considered when creating content. There's just this massive gap where different groups, diverse groups, are just not considered. So I've been taking MOSL on a bit of a digital accessibility journey, which has been a bit of a labour of love. And I still find it surprising how far we collectively have come in a digital age. Yet being able to communicate effectively to a diverse audience is still a lot of times considered a bit of an afterthought. So it's about bringing it back into the conversation as opposed to it being done after the fact.
Great, thank you, Sophie. Abu, I'm going to come to you now with the first question, and I'll come to each of you in the same order, maybe picking up on a couple of points you made in your introduction. So I was going to ask each of you, how do you think about your background, your upbringing, your culture impacts the way you communicate? And Abu, you mentioned about the use of the word purdah. That was a learning journey I've been on. It's a term I'd heard used multiple times, and then when I looked into that in detail, I was actually quite horrified that it was language that I'd used readily. So what do you think about your sort of core, how you've been brought up? How does that impact the way in which you communicate in the workplace?
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you. So yeah, I can speak to the use of that word and hearing it growing up quite a lot. I think I basically grew up quite stunted, if I'm being honest, and isolated. I would say I didn't really know how to communicate with people that didn't look like myself or sound like myself for a long time, up until I went to college, and then the world opened up to me, and then I became an oyster, or the world became an oyster. Sorry, one of those phrases. So yeah, it was a bit of a isolated experience growing up, a bit like a cult, honestly, and that term purdah, I used to hear it quite often, and I didn't really think about what it meant until much later on in life, when I realized, it has quite a lot of negative connotations, and it can be quite a bit of a trigger for some people. Not for myself, but it could be a trigger for others. And I had a quite interesting conversation with my wife about that when Lydia came and spoke about it. So not with my background upbringing, I basically learned a lot of mannerisms and small talk when I went to college, and basically went out to the world and spoke to people. I wasn't isolated or put in a little bubble anymore, which was quite eye-opening for me. I think with my South Asian background, I think South Asians in general can be a bit jokey, I think, or I'd like to think we are. And I live in London. I'm a bit of a Londoner, so that's made me even more memey, I guess. So I'm memey in nature, but I don't know if I'm memey in nature because I'm scared of being serious and then people will be bored of me. So maybe I'm memey in nature because I'm scared of boring people. I don't know. That's a bit of a thing that I need to work through.
It's a bit deep, Abu.
I have thought about that in the last 10 years. Why do I keep memeing? But I think it might just be I just like being lighthearted and not being serious all the time. So that's one thing for me to think about. South Asian culture, there is quite a big deal in respecting and being respectful to elders in the way you communicate or interact or engage, which I don't necessarily agree with being respectful to just elders. I think you should have a baseline of respect that you extend to all humans in your interactions and engagements, and then you can increase or decrease that based on your feelings of them, rather than you're elder than me, you may be abusing me or maybe saying horrific things to me. I'm still going to respect you regardless of that. I don't agree with that kind of principle or sentiment, and that's sometimes prevalent in South Asian culture, or can be. And I mentioned the introversion. So I'm more introverted than extroverted or omniverted, I think. But that doesn't mean I don't want to engage or communicate. It's just I have preferences on how I may interact or engage. And sometimes I might be a bit awkward. But I guess that's me. So yeah.
Right, thanks. Thank you, Abu. That's really honest. Campbell, I wanted to pick up the same question with you, but also, I guess, pick up something you said, that we said some of these conversations are uncomfortable, and I'm really interested in how your background and the way in which you've been brought up has given you the confidence to communicate in the way you do. But also, you use the word cripple. That makes me feel uncomfortable, because in my head that is a very derogatory term. So really interested to understand how you have I guess, claimed that as your own and feel quite proud to use it?
So I guess so as you probably noticed, I have a speech impediment, and it was quite a lot worse when I was little. So I spent a lot of my childhood getting quite angry at people because no one really knew what I was saying. And that was quite frustrating, being quite a clever child and not really being able to communicate. My mum is a very loud bisexual feminist. My dad's a family barrister, so I grew up in a kind of confident household where I was encouraged to like speak my mind and be who I wanted to be. So I think that shaped a lot of how I am. I was always kind of given the space to communicate unapologetically, and I think that really shaped the person I am. At school, a lot of my friends were foreign children, so I grew up near a Toyota factory, so there were a lot of Japanese students at my school, and they were often my friends, and I think I often gravitated to the other people that sort of stood out, having never really fit in anywhere. I did a chemical engineering degree partly to prove how clever I was, because when you say to someone you've got a chemical engineering degree, they no longer think you have learning difficulties. So maybe not the best reason to pick a degree, but yeah, that definitely, I've always felt that I need to prove how clever I am to kind of compensate for internalized ableism and just the way people interact with me in the world. I guess in terms of in terms of my kind of advocation and stuff, I was always more interested in kind of feminism and women's rights when I was younger, and I was sort of told when I went to university people would be a lot more accepting, because you kind of interacting with smarter people, and I think it was quite a big disappointment for me really to realise nothing really changed the older I got. And I think then I started to focus more on disability rights and what that meant for me, and get involved in that community and sort of rigging up on kind of the disability movement mainly within the UK and America. The slogan from the UK were piss and pity, and the word crippled and stuff is quite often used in terms of kind of activism and stuff, and thinking about my relationship with the word disability and not really feeling like that was the best word. As someone with a physical disability, crippled has a lot of negative connotation nowadays, but the word itself could be reclaimed. They've got anything inherently wrong with the word, like it was first introduced in the early 1900s and was just used to describe someone who limped. So there's no reason why that can't be reclaimed. So yeah, and also again, I think it's good to kind of put people out of their comfort zone as well, and sort of encourage them to think a bit differently about terms and just have that discussion. I mean, I'm going on a bit, but I always say I know someone's my friend when they ask me what's wrong with me. It normally takes about a week of knowing someone before they ask what my disability actually is. I try and be quite open about it and name the elephant in the room quicker, but it's not something to be ashamed of, and I try and be confident about it, and it's part of me. I can't escape it, so yeah.
Great, thank you, Campbell, and thank you for your honesty. I think some interesting but an interesting point from Candice in the chat around how some terms are medical terms that then sort of become slurs, and actually you're absolutely right, you go back to the origin of the word, and actually it's been misused. So thank you. Sophie, again coming back to you then, your real passion for how we communicate with each other in a more digital world, how would you relate that back to your sort of culture upbringing?
Yeah, so I always considered my background to be quite quote unquote standard. White, working class, neurotypical, no additional needs within the family. My parents were a product of their environment where things that are now considered really non-PC were quite normal in conversation. I wasn't going to say it, but I think it's really important that we do say things that are, you know, were uncomfortable. So, for example, there was no malice behind it, but, you know, our local newsagents was owned by an Indian family. So my parents would say, go to the Paki shop, or our local Chinese takeaway, we're going to get a chinky. And it was just so normalized. And where I went to an all-girls school where the biggest insult was, you're a lesbian. And then that person would run away from you. And that's the environment that I grew up in. There wasn't a lot of checking privilege, acknowledgement of microaggressions, like jokes that were considered sort of banter that are massively offensive was just normalized. So there wasn't really a lot of thought into how I communicated with people, and I probably made a lot of mistakes in the past. But you don't know what you don't know, and that may be one of the reasons why now I worry so much about whether people like me or whether I offend somebody. But when you're young and you see your parents and their friends acting a certain way, it becomes so normalized. And it can massively impact the way that you communicate with people and how big your circle is. Naturally, I kind of grew out of it, thank God. I was exposed to a lot of different people at university. My world got bigger. And ironically, I was always taught to be really kind and considerate and open. So I came with an open mind and began to learn for myself about how I really wanted to conduct myself and not keep my world so small. And I do have sort of a natural kind of curiosity to learn. And, you know, I'm really nosy. I love just learning about people and their backgrounds, and working in comms, that kind of goes hand in hand. So, yeah, it's kind of past experience versus a desire to kind of just learn more, which has kind of brought me to where I am, really.
Yeah. And it's interesting you use that word, Sophie, again, the use of language. I remember describing myself as a negative trait of being nosy early on in my career, and being told by somebody who was a huge sponsor for me that I wasn't nosy, I was curious. I'm not sure whether that's better, it depends how you describe curious, but that curiosity can be interpreted many ways. I'm going to stick with you, Sophie, actually, for the next question, which is around, what do you think the future of communication looks like as technology evolves further and our workplace expectations shift?
Yeah, I think that we are at the risk of things becoming very cut and paste, quite conformative and impersonal, and inauthentic. I think that with the increased reliance on AI, I think as a comms person, doing anything with AI feels really against my nature, because otherwise I'll be out of a job. But for example, you know, with AI bots that are designed to come across as sounding like a real person, I think, for example, I raised this to a few of my colleagues the other day, that there's a company in France that you can pay £25 a month to, and they will call your parents for you. So your elderly parents can have a conversation with somebody that's not you, just so they don't feel lonely. And wow, that just makes me feel really deeply uncomfortable. But in a way, I can see the appeal, because the world is moving faster than ever. I think demands on people within the workplace in general are increasing. So increased pressure means that people may be willing to kind of cut corners, tick boxes, to move, you know, onto the next thing on their plate. And attention spans are shortening, so people feel like they don't have the time to consume everything. So you can ask things like AI for summaries. People want to communicate in sound bites, so everything is getting quicker and snappier. But by doing this, you lose sight of differing language for different audiences and considering what people actually need. Everything's just moving so quickly, which is why I think spaces like this are so important, because it's a reminder that marginalized groups still exist, the need for human interaction exists, the need for consideration of individual needs exists, and spaces like this give us a chance to just kind of slow down and reflect and just think.
Great, thanks, Soph. I'm going to come to you, Campbell, with a slightly different question, but on a similar theme. What's your view on whether our new hybrid ways of working has improved our ability to work together and to communicate, or does it pose new challenges? Sophie's touched on a couple of those around how it can all become a bit virtual. What's your view?
I think it's very easy for people to talk about the negative with hybrid working, but I think if you look about studies into it, flexible working has significant improvements in work-life balance, in productivity, and it's just, I think not enough is said about the benefits of it. Like, I even think, you know, pre-COVID, I did consultancy work mainly, going up and down the country, traveling, you know, you spend crazy hours just traveling, and, you know, all that time we get back from being able to work at home, you know, you think about doctor's appointments and stuff, and it's just so much more convenient to have this model of working. And I think we often talk about work and home life as separate entities, but they're very much, you know, tied together. And if you can't reach that balance, it affects your life inside and outside of work. And I think hybrid working is just the best option, really, if you treat people like adults and you trust them to manage their own time. Like, we know a lot more now about different people's learning styles, and that also applies to people working styles, and trusting people to be able to manage their own time just increases productivity. Obviously there are issues with, you know, I've been in team meetings where everyone's muted, you can't see them, and it's just awkward. But again, you forget even in in-person meetings, people would switch off, they wouldn't engage. You know, hybrid, it's all about hybrid. There's certain situations where it's better to do things in person, but I just think treating people like adults and allowing them to manage their own time is always a good way forward.
Thank you for that, Campbell. That's really interesting. I agree that point about, one of the things I say a lot is that let's assume good intent. Let's assume people are going to do the right thing and then deal with it if they don't. But let's focus on the assumption most people are good humans and want to do the right thing in the workplace. So I'm going to ask you the same question, Abu, but I'm going to ask you a follow-up from the chat. So quick thoughts on hybrid working and the impact on communications, and then I'll come back to you for a bit of a follow-up.
Yeah, sure. I think hybrid way of working is the future, and it probably needs to be the future. I think there are some meetings that could be better or more efficient if they were done remotely, or you know, don't have to be in person. But there are other situations like Campbell mentioned, other situations where it's better to be in person. For example, with brainstorming, workshopping, etc. And I also like the hands up function that Teams has and Zoom has. You know, I don't feel like I'm butting in because I'm in the queue. And I like queues, or I don't like queues as a British person. Sorry. So I think hybrid way of working is great. Obviously, it does need to be done in a good manner. I also think that with a hybrid way of working, you have to be more intentional in how you do work and how you communicate, how you engage, and when you speak to people, because all of this is like a nice protection for me, but also inhibits me from maybe being as natural as I could be. So I need to be intentional about how I seek out people, speak to people, and engage with people when I work. So there are, you know, different methods of interacting that I need to be aware of. Yeah.
Thanks, Abu. And the follow-up is related to the risk that because of social media and cancel culture and everything you see online, that we can quickly get, I'm going to slightly paraphrase Liv's question, we can get sort of sucked into all of our beliefs and conversations being held in a virtual space, and that can restrict the time to debate these really important subjects like we're doing today. What's your view on that?
Yeah, for sure. I think there are certain spaces online in the virtual world that are, even the real world, really, to be honest, that are like echo chambers, and you go and you seek out the information that perhaps validates your way of thinking, and I think that can be quite that can be quite dangerous. I think it's always good to see different perspectives and see what people are talking about, thinking about from across the world. Even if you don't necessarily agree with those views, you can interrogate yourself and why you don't align with those positions. You know, I don't align with Trump's positions or Elon Musk's positions, and I know why, and I'm quite happy and quite stable in my reasons for disagreement. I think if I was always around people that I agree with, eventually I'd probably be a bit suspicious, honestly, because like, hang on, this is not how the world is set up to be. And same in the virtual space as well. I think there probably needs to be a level of maturity though when it comes to interacting online on TikTok, Instagram, or other platforms. And I think personally, I think these companies, Meta and others, and X, just haven't done enough to make these spaces have constructive, meaningful conversations. Sometimes it's become like a slur of just really toxic information, misinformation. So I think there's a lot more these companies can be doing. But also we have a personal responsibility not to take something and then forward it on without fact checking ourselves. That's exactly what happened last summer, right? And we had protests and riots across the UK based on misinformation. So yeah, that's my response, I guess, Sarah.
Thanks, Abu. And you've partially answered Anna's question as well. But Sophie, I'm going to come to you next on the similar question around, given it's your area of expertise and passion around digital communications, the same question around, is there a risk that because of that social media cancel culture, we no longer leave space for debate? But as a follow-up, do you think that cancel culture exists, or is it just about us being accountable for our own words, which is pretty much Abu's expressed for you?
Yeah, I do absolutely believe that cancel culture exists. However, I think that there's a like I said, there is a difference between being accountable versus going on a bit of a witch hunt. And you see a lot of people, you know, in the celebrity world, in the pop culture world, where, you know, the particularly with women, the higher you're put up on the pedestal, it's only a certain amount of time before you get pulled down. And a lot of people, you know, their job is to hunt for negative press about you, something you said 5 years ago, something you said 6 years ago. I remember there was a exercise in my university where they asked us to go through our social media accounts and actually look back and see if there was something that could be used against you in the you know, as you move on. And I did find some things where I was probably a little bit non-PC, and I was like, okay, yeah. But I think I was listening to a podcast this morning with Michelle Obama, and she was talking about how that you can kind of take your feed and your algorithm back to be around kind of diverse voices. And I think that's really important because diversity invites challenge. It invites, you know, I think she said something like, if you're in a room or if you're having a conversation and everybody has the same view at you as you're doing something wrong. So that's something that I kind of try to do, is tailor my kind of social media algorithm to kind of put in a bit of a range of voices. And I kind of do that just by watching different people and engaging in a certain way. And then my Instagram is now a really great place. My Instagram, for example, my TikTok is actually a really, really great place to be. I also think as well that Abby, what you were saying about there needs to be a level of maturity. Trolling is a full-time job for some people. When, you know, you can tell that, you know, people create accounts just to tear someone down. And it's really hard not to kind of engage with those. I've been subject to it before. And yeah, I think it's about kind of being a bit more kind of realistic when you're kind of being baited. And when you know that someone is just trying to get at you. And and it's a shame because, as Abu says, in the social media platforms, there's no real any kind of policing, and there's no consequence for going and tearing somebody down. And I think it is a real shame. And I do think people will then, if you're not really, really confident and extroverted and you're ready, you've got the thickest skin ever, yeah, you it can shut someone down. And I think that's a real shame.
Thank you, Sophie. Campbell, same question for you, I guess. The sort of that broader question around conversations that play out on social media and the degree to which that can become the only place that we're having these conversations, apart from like today where we're having this conversation in real life.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. So I got kicked out of a women debating forum on social media years ago now, but in that cancel culture, and that was around the conversation, I guess, again, bringing in controversy around trans women in sport. For those who don't know, I compete in disability sports. And the conversation I was trying to have, if people remember Oscar Pistorius, and when he tried to compete in the Olympics because of his fake leg, there was discussion around whether he had an advantage, and there was lots of testing that he had to go through to see if he was able to compete. And you know, I was having trying to have the conversation around the small margins in competitive sport, and you know, whether in disability sport we have categories and whether we could have an additional category. And a lot of people in the group didn't even participate in sport and were very set on the opinion that trans women should be allowed to compete, and there was no room for kind of the nuanced discussions around what's the best way going forward, and it all went horribly wrong. And I think from that I learned social media really isn't a great place to have nuanced discussions about anything really, and I try and keep it offline. A lot of my boyfriend's family voted reform and are big reformers, and having conversation with them, because again, when you have conversation with people, you often realise that what they actually want is the same. They just have misguided viewpoints, in my opinion, on how you achieve that. And I think it's only by being open and having proper non-judgmental conversation with people that you can kind of get down to the roots of what everyone wants. Because I think fundamentally, having spoken to various right-wing people, what they really want is equality deep down. I know that sounds weird, but you know, they feel like they're being attacked, and we need to address the issues of why, you know, and the sort of shame that some people feel about being a straight white man and feel attacked within society. Whether that's correct or not, we need to properly engage with the reasons why people feel like this so that we can move forward and come to an agreement. If that, I went off on the run a bit there. But
no, absolutely, no. That was great, Campbell, and I think that point around ensuring, for me, that the power of having open conversations, of being able to express counter views, but then you used a really important point, is those conversations are nuanced. You need to understand motivation, you need to understand what exactly that person is saying, and it's really hard to do that completely digitally. Luckily, the only person who would object to my social posts would be my dogs, because they're all about my cats, so I don't engage much with social media. I've got another question from the chat. I'm just going to ask Abby, remind me, how much time do you need at the end for the final exercise?
Possibly about 10 minutes or so.
Bro. Okay, so we've got another 5 minutes or so of questions. So a question from Angela. She was saying she would not feel comfortable using the terms such as queer or crippled to describe someone else, as I am not queer or crippled. Be interested to know the panel's thoughts on this, as context is everything. Is it appropriate for somebody who doesn't relate to those terms, I guess, to use them, or is it that these terms remain, I guess, claimed and exclusive to the people in that community? I'll come to you first on that, Campbell.
I think currently as it stands, you need to, I think it's a bit like with pronouns. I feel like you need to have a conversation. I feel like echoing. Okay, there we go. I feel like you need to have a conversation with what the person prefers, and just kind of, I mean, generally, you know, people sometimes use terms, like, I don't like being called inspirational, but I can tell by the way people use the word, and like, again, it's all contextual. You know, if someone called me crippled and I could tell, you know, and then my friend, and I could tell they didn't mean any harm by it. I wouldn't really mind. And obviously people like, no, I prefer that word, you know. And I think having, in my opinion, having terms that only people within a certain group can use in the long term is counterproductive. I think that's how a lot of terms start and then move, you know, once you've got a consensus from the group, move into the more general popular. Like, to me, I feel like queer is almost at that point, whereas the N word, I wouldn't say, you know, and I feel like there's sort of an evolution that words go through, and it almost gets the approval from the people it's about, and then it can be used in a wider setting, if that makes sense.
Great, thanks, Campbell. I'm going to come to you now, Abby. You mentioned the use of the term BAME. We've had conversations in the past about how you would describe yourself from an ethnicity and colour perspective. How do you feel about how you would describe yourself, and then how others would choose to describe you?
So I pretty much always describe myself as a British Bangladeshi Muslim man, because all four of those things mean quite a lot to me. And you can probably already tell the first thing about me, the first two things about me are quite noticeable, are South Asian background as well as being a man. So I never really had a major issue with the term BAME or BAME, because people had, I guess, preconceptions or ideas of what that meant, and then I just fit into that group. For me, it's more of a logical thing. Am I black or Asian, or am I in a minority ethnic group within this country? And I sort of fit into that group, and my mathematical, logical brain said, yeah, that's fine. But listening to others, that whole pigeonholing aspect came into it, where people felt like, well, that's black, Asian people, and minority ethnic people in this country actually probably form a large part of the world's people. And actually, another term for minority ethnic is global majority, which I prefer to use. I'm part of the global majority.
I use that all the time. I learned that from you, Abby.
Oh, great. Okay, cool. Thank you. Thanks. That actually empowers me. Actually, or makes me feel empowered. So even, you know, I as a South Asian man will have completely different views from other South Asian men. As I as a Muslim man will have different views from other Muslim men. I always think of it as logically, and I guess it comes back to that bit around maybe malice that was mentioned by Sophie and others, that I didn't think BAME had been put together or established as a malicious thing. It came as like let's identify this group, and it maybe was not done or developed or designed in the right way. So now other terms are used. But yeah, it's whatever term we use, we need to describe people by what they think is best to be described, as you know, Hannah mentioned in the chat as well.
Great, thank you, Abu. I'm going to do a quick fire final question before Abu looks for some, just to warn the audience, some audience participation beyond the questions. So I'm going to come to you first, Sophie. What language shift do you think has been the most positive during your working life?
I think it's the recognition of gendered language. For me, it's a bit of double-edged sword, as I'm now hyper aware of it. So if someone uses gendered language with no ill intent, whilst I acknowledge it, it also really gets my back up. And I need to remember that everybody's on their own journey and they might not, you know, realize it. One example being, I was once presenting with another woman, and a male colleague said, "Thank you, girls," at the end of the presentation. Now, I don't think this person meant any malice, but I don't actually remember much about what the presentation was about. But I do remember that comment about how it made me feel like a little girl in a room full of big boys. And I think it's also important because I've always worked in teams that are predominantly female. I was in an all-female editorial team for a fashion retailer, and we were called the editorial girls. And it came with lots of stereotypes of being catty, gossipy, sensitive. And my colleagues were lovely, but there was a negative stereotype that hung there. Yeah. I think whilst awareness is kind of changed, my confidence in being able to call it out has also changed. Like if someone was to call me a comms girl, I feel confident to then potentially call them a finance boy, for example, and highlight how strange it feels. So yeah, I feel more confident calling it out now, but then you see it everywhere.
Thank you, Sophie. I'm going to come to you, Campbell, but it's interesting. Your career's not as long as mine has been. I've been 31 years in water now, and if I had to answer that question, it would be the same thing, that move away from some of the very gendered language that I experienced early on in my career. Not to say it doesn't happen today, but that confidence to call it out and that lack of acceptability of it, I think, is a big shift. Campbell, same question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the reverse. You could work for a startup South African company where for a lot of it I was the only woman, and there were a few older South African men who made some interesting comments over the time period. But again, the culture generally, I call it out and they'd be apologetic, and it was generally very supportive. I think the most positive thing on a similar note is, this movement towards pronouns, and I generally think there is a general openness to having the conversations around preferences and being able to call people out and get a positive response and sort of a learning environment, especially in the places I've worked. Although I do feel like having a disability is a bit of a kind of litmus test. I found it quite hard to find a job, and so a place that would employ me is likely to have quite an open culture. So I don't know how much of my experience has been filtered by the fact that they'll hire a disabled woman.
Wow, that is a really interesting thought, Campbell, and probably a thought for a I think you've just given us a thought for our conference in the autumn. Yeah, so thank you for that. Abu, I'm going to come to you for a final your views on the biggest change in language, and then hand back to you to take us through the final part of this webinar.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. I think the biggest language shift I've seen, or most positive, and maybe this is just only one part of the UK or society, or maybe just the water sector, is people wanting to pronounce things in a more accurate way, pronounce names and non-English words, and trying to be respectful and be accurate and be mindful of different cultures and backgrounds. I say that, but that might just be one sliver of UK society and the perspective that I see for the water industry. I would say though that it would be nice not to call out anyone here or anyone in general. It would be nice if the S in Muslim and Islam could be pronounced as an S and not as a Z. I've always wondered why it's a Z pronounced as a Z and not an S. That would always baffle me. It's written with an S as well, but I'm not sure why the Z gets in there. So that's something for anyone really just take away or think about. But yeah, that's my general thought.
Thanks, Abu. So on that note, it is back to you.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I'm very, very quick with this. I'm going to share my screen. So we wanted to cap this off with an audience exercise. Just involve yourselves some more. We have 3 questions that we wanted to get your perspectives on, and I'll share the link of these in the chat. I know we only have about 5 minutes left, so I'll share it here. To share perspectives on these following 3 areas. Firstly, how often do you yourselves understand the context of situations and communicate using the right words and the right language? The purpose of this really is to gauge our abilities and how we think or don't think about context, and if we're using and conscious about using the right language. Second question, what holds you back personally from engaging with someone that you're not, they don't know or are unsure of? And you can just give a few words. For example, you don't engage with them because they might find you intrusive, as an example. The purpose of this is to self-reflect and to interrogate biases and any concerns that we have when it comes to engaging with people or other ways that we may interact with them. And third question, how would you yourself describe how you are and what you are, I guess. A few words on this would do. For example, I mentioned before being a British Bangladeshi Muslim man, as well as a bit of a memer and a cat dad or a cat minion, depending on how you look at it. I think it's really important to understand how we see ourselves, and if the way we see ourselves is how others see us as well. If we think of ourselves as being friendly or a memer, is that how others see us? Will that impact how they approach us, interact with us, whether they want to talk to us, whether they want to be careful around us? So our perceptions of ourselves and others' perceptions of us can greatly influence how we interact and engage with others in the world. So hopefully that link in the chat worked, and I'll stop sharing now. I don't think. Do you want me to share the results very quickly in the next 3 minutes, or do you want to round things off, Sarah?
So can you? Can you do that magic? Can it come in to the form, and then can you share it with us?
Yeah, I can do it now.
Yeah. Okay, as it starts coming, I'll just Okay, so we need some more responses in. We've got 2 in so far. So I wanted to just finish whilst we're getting the data coming in. So please do keep putting it in. I just wanted to share 2 things. I guess starting with a big thank you to our 3 panelists for being really honest and open and sharing some quite personal experiences and thoughts. So thank you to all 3 of you. These conversations matter. It's important that we have conversations which are uncomfortable. As always, when I have these sorts of conversations, I have learnt from the 3 of you and have got some ideas banging around in my head in terms of what we cover in our autumn EDI conference, which again, anybody who's here joining this webinar, if you have any thoughts on things after today that this has prompted in your thinking that you'd like us to look at, then that would be really, really great. I just wanted to pick out a few sort of headlines for me. I think probably the biggest thing I've taken away from this is that whilst language is really important, it's more important to have a baseline respect to all humans. And if you think about that in the start of your communication, it will influence the words you use. Really thoughtful comments about the work-life balance and how that there are definitely benefits, but how those communications and those conversations we need to make space for those. And I think probably biggest thing for me is that the confidence in calling it out, but doing that in a way that is not defensive or aggressive. It is about being curious around why somebody's used that language and just making them aware that actually you might not think that's offensive, but this is how it makes me feel. I have a personal view. Nobody can argue with how something makes me feel. They can argue whether it make them feel like that, but they can't argue the way in which something makes me feel. So those are some of my takeaways. Abu, with the results coming in, do you want to just call out some of the things that you've seen from here? And we can share afterwards what this data is showing us.
Sure, yeah, happy to share afterwards as well. It was quite interesting that most people put in most of the time, which was great to see. So that's the interpretation of situations. I thought probably be more sometimes, but it's good to see most of the time. On what holds you back, I think fear of offending was what came up. Social battery, intense conversations, being an introvert, past experiences. I think all these are very understandable. So we've all had them. Then have a think about, I guess, the person you're interacting with, how they're feeling as well. How would you describe yourself? Oh, these are all really quite cool ones. Curious human, woman, white woman, inclusive woman, lover of football. So yeah, these are all really really nice descriptions. And yeah, I'll share some of these afterwards as well with everyone on the call.
Great, thank you. And I think then with perfect timing, a final thank you to our panelists and thank you to all of you for joining us today, but also for some really great questions and comments in the chat. So thank you very much.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Sarah.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.